This is my true story. After my husband died, my only reason to keep going was my daughter. I gave her everything I had. But one rainy night, she looked at me in front of her friends and said, "You smell old. Go eat outside." The laughter that followed broke something in me. I sat in the rain, my plate soaking, my heart colder than the weather. I stayed quiet that night, but I didn't forget, and I didn't forgive. What I did next changed everything. Before I tell you what I did, comment if you ever felt humiliated by your own son or daughter, and please subscribe so my story reaches others. I raised my daughter through storms most people would never survive. When my husband passed away, the world felt heavy on my shoulders, but I didn't let it crush me. I worked 2 jobs, one cleaning offices late into the night, and another serving coffee during the day, so she could have food on the table and clothes that made her feel proud at school. I wore the same coat for 7 winters, so she could have new ones every year. I skipped meals more times than I could count, just to make sure she never had to go to bed hungry. Birthdays for her were always special, even when I couldn't afford much. I'd bake her favorite cake from scratch, wrap her small gifts with care, and write her cards telling her how proud I was of the person she was becoming. I believed that love wasn't about how much you had, but about how much you gave. When she was accepted into college, I cried harder than I had at my own wedding. I paid every cent of her tuition with savings I had built over decades. Money I could have used to finally fix my teeth or buy a better bed for my aching back, but instead, I invested it in her future. I wanted her to have a life where she wouldn't have to struggle like I did. I worked extra shifts so she could focus on studying instead of worrying about bills. And when she graduated, I stood in the crowd clapping until my hands stung, tears running down my cheeks because all my sacrifices felt worth it. When she got married, I was the one who paid for the wedding dress she wanted. I didn't just help here and there. I paid for the catering, the flowers, even the honeymoon. I remember handing over the last check and telling her, "I just want you to be happy." And when she and her new husband were looking for a home, I dipped into the last of my retirement savings to give them the down payment. I signed the purchase papers myself and put the deed in my name. Just for safety, I thought at the time. I trusted her completely and believed she would always respect me. I was proud of the life I'd given her, proud that I had kept my promise to her father on his deathbed, that I would raise her with love, no matter the cost to myself. I never thought that one day that same daughter would treat me like an inconvenience, like something to hide from the world. I believed that our bond was unshakable, that no matter what happened, she would remember the nights I came home exhausted, but still cooked her favorite meal. The mornings I walked her to school, holding her hand, despite the freezing wind. The afternoons I cheered for her at every school event. But I was wrong. Somewhere along the way, the love I had poured into her became something she stopped seeing. The respect I thought we had built together slowly faded from her eyes. And without realizing it, I had gone from being her mother to being someone she could easily push aside. It didn't happen all at once. That's the part that hurt the most. It was slow, almost invisible at first. Little things that I brushed off because I didn't want to believe what they meant. I started noticing how her voice changed when she spoke to me. It wasn't warm anymore. It was clipped, impatient, like every word I said was stealing her time. She used to call me Mom with affection. Now it sounded more like a reminder that she had to deal with me. It began with comments that she framed as jokes. She would say things like, "You still wear that?" when I had on my old cardigan, or "That perfume smells like a retirement home," when I wore the scent her father once bought me. At first, I laughed along, thinking she was just teasing me. I told myself, she's just tired from work. She doesn't mean it. But over time, those comments became sharper, more public. She started pointing out my age, my wrinkles, the way I walked slower than her, as if getting older was something I should be ashamed of. Family outings became fewer, and when they happened, I often wasn't invited. If I asked about a trip or dinner, she would say, "Oh, it was last minute," or "You wouldn't have enjoyed it anyway." But I knew the truth. She didn't want me there. I noticed she started putting physical distance between us in photos, barely touching me when we stood side by side. When guests came over, she introduced me in a flat tone. "This is my mom," as though I was just another piece of furniture in the room. She stopped asking how I was feeling, and when I tried to share something about my health or a memory from the past, she'd cut me off or look at her phone. Once, when I offered to help cook, she said, "Maybe you should just rest. The kitchen gets too crowded when you're in it." I remember standing there, my hands empty, feeling like I had been quietly pushed out of the space I used to belong to. Then came the rules, small, demeaning ones. She told me not to use certain plates because they were too expensive. She asked me to sit on a certain chair because it's easier to clean if you spill. She even started telling me not to hug my grandchildren too much because they would get too clingy. I would laugh it off in front of her, but inside, every word chipped away at something that had once been strong inside me. I began to realize that in her eyes, I was no longer the woman who had carried her through every storm. I was a burden she tolerated. She didn't see the years of work, the sacrifices, the dreams I had set aside for her. She only saw the lines on my face, the slower pace of my steps, and the fact that I was still in her life when maybe she had imagined I wouldn't be. But the moment that would shatter what was left of my hope hadn't come yet. That would happen on a rainy night, in front of her friends, when she would strip away not just my dignity, but every illusion I had left about the love between us. It was a Friday evening, the kind of night that used to mean warmth, laughter, and shared meals. The rain outside was heavy, steady, the kind that makes you want to stay indoors, wrapped in a blanket, with the smell of good food filling the air. My daughter had invited a few friends over for dinner. I had spent the afternoon helping in small ways, setting out the plates, folding napkins, though she barely acknowledged it. I thought maybe, just maybe, tonight would be different. When it was time to eat, I made my way toward the dining table, carrying my plate. The laughter was loud, glasses clinking, and for a moment I felt like I was walking into something I could belong to again. But as I reached the table, my daughter stopped me. She didn't take me aside quietly. She didn't whisper. She looked straight at me, in front of her guests, and said in a voice that carried over the sound of the rain, "You smell old. Go eat outside." The room went silent for a split second. I saw her friends exchange awkward glances, some looking down, others forcing small, uncomfortable smiles. No one spoke. No one defended me. My hands trembled slightly as I stood there, still holding my plate. I felt the heat rush to my face, not from anger, but from humiliation so deep it burned. I wanted to believe she was joking, that any second she would laugh and say, "I'm kidding, Mom, sit down." But her eyes told me she wasn't joking. They were cold, flat, and impatient. She nodded toward the back door, like I was a child being told to leave the grown-ups alone. So I walked. I opened the sliding door, stepped onto the porch, and the rain welcomed me like a punishment. The cold drops soaked through my cardigan almost instantly, and my hair clung to my face. I sat down at the small metal table outside, placing my plate in front of me. The chair was wet, and soon my skirt was too. Inside, I could hear them. The laughter picked back up, the conversations flowing as though I had never been there at all. Each bite of food felt heavier than the last, and not because of the rain. It was the weight of knowing I was no longer seen as a mother, no longer seen as someone worth a seat at her table. I was an outsider in the very home I had helped her build. The rain blurred my vision, but I couldn't tell which drops on my cheeks were from the sky and which were from me. I looked through the window at the warm light inside, the clinking of glasses, the way she leaned in close to her friends, smiling as if nothing had happened. It struck me then. This wasn't a sudden cruelty. This was the culmination of every small humiliation she had dealt me over the years, finally made public. I finished my meal in silence, my hands cold and stiff. When I stood up, my legs felt heavy, my clothes clinging to me like the shame I carried back into the house. I didn't look at anyone as I walked past the dining room, and no one looked at me. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain until it stopped. Somewhere between the sound of the last drop and the silence that followed, I decided that would be the last time my dignity was ever left out in the cold. The rain didn't let up. It came down in sheets, bouncing off the porch railing, pooling around the legs of the chair I sat on. The plate of food in front of me was already spotted with water before I even took the first bite. I held the fork in my hand, but my grip felt weak. My cardigan clung to my arms, heavy and damp, and each breath I took brought in the smell of wet concrete and cold air. I shivered, but I kept eating, not because I was hungry, but because I didn't want her to see me walk back in too soon. Every bite tasted like metal. The rainwater had run into the food, turning the mashed potatoes into a pale, thin paste. The meat was cold by the second bite. Still, I chewed slowly, forcing each mouthful down, because in that moment, it wasn't about the food. It was about not giving her the satisfaction of thinking she had broken me. I would sit there until I was done, no matter how long it took, no matter how much it hurt. From inside, I could hear her voice, bright, warm, full of charm for her friends. I could hear the clinking of glasses, the bursts of laughter, the scraping of forks against plates. And over it all, I could hear the sound of rain hitting the roof just above me, a steady reminder of where I had been placed. Outside, in the cold, in the wet, in the dark. A gust of wind blew rain sideways across the porch, soaking the side of my face. I wiped it away with my sleeve, but it didn't matter. I was already drenched through. My feet were cold in my shoes, the fabric of my skirt heavy and sticking to my legs. My hands ached from the chill, and the fork trembled in my fingers. I tried not to look through the glass door, but my eyes kept finding their way there. I saw them raise their glasses in a toast, saw her leaning forward with a smile that could melt stone. And it hit me. She could be kind when she wanted to be. She could make people feel welcome, important, cherished. But she chose not to give that to me. Not anymore. Maybe not ever again. Halfway through the meal, I realized something that made my stomach turn more than the cold food. She hadn't just done this on impulse. She had planned it. She had known her friends would be here, that I would come to the table, and that she would make a scene. The way she said it, clear, loud, cutting, it wasn't just to get me out of the room. It was to make sure everyone in that room saw me leave. It was a performance. The rain softened for a moment, only to pick up again, harder this time. I set my fork down, pressing my hands together to try to warm them. My shoulders ached from hunching against the wind. My breath came out in faint clouds. Still, I stayed. I stayed because leaving would mean she had the power to drive me away before I was ready. When I finally took my last bite, the food was nothing but a soggy mess on a cold plate. I set it down carefully, wiped my mouth with the edge of my sleeve, and stood. My legs felt heavy, like I was walking through water. I stepped back inside quietly, the warm air of the house rushing against my cold skin. But not one person turned to look. Not one person asked if I was all right. As I walked past the table, I caught her eyes for just a moment. There was no guilt there, no shame, just a flicker of annoyance that I had returned at all. I kept walking, my wet shoes leaving small marks on the polished floor, and I went straight to my room. I shut the door, sat on the bed, and stared at the wall. It was in that silence that I knew something had shifted in me. I wasn't just hurt anymore. I wasn't just sad. I was finished. After that night in the rain, something in the air between us changed. Or maybe it had always been there, and I had just started noticing it in full. She didn't speak to me with warmth anymore, only with instructions, as though I were a burden that needed constant management. Small moments began to add up, each one cutting deeper than the last. They were never explosive. They were quiet, calculated, the kind of things you could deny if someone confronted you about them. She started telling me not to hug the grandchildren too much. At first, I thought she was joking, but her face stayed serious. She said it in front of them too, so they began to pull away a little, as though my embrace might somehow bother them. I could still see the confusion in their eyes when they'd glance between me and their mother. I forced myself to smile every time, so they wouldn't feel the awkwardness, but inside, it hurt more than I wanted to admit. On another afternoon, I had baked cookies for the children. I had wrapped them neatly and placed them in a tin. But when guests came over, I noticed she had hidden the tin in a kitchen cabinet, far from the snacks she'd set out on the counter. She didn't want anyone to see them. When I asked why, she brushed it off with, "They're not fancy enough." It wasn't about the cookies. It was about erasing me from the picture whenever someone else was watching. Then there was the day I touched a porcelain vase in the living room, a piece I had actually bought years ago on a trip. She told me, without even looking at me, to wash my hands before touching anything expensive. Her friends laughed softly, like it was a joke, but I could feel my ears burning. I didn't say a word. I just walked away, my fingers tingling like I'd actually done something wrong. Meals became another battleground. She'd serve everyone else first, then pass me my plate last, almost as an afterthought. Sometimes she wouldn't even set a place for me at the table until I got up to do it myself. When I did, she'd make a comment about how some people just can't sit still, like my need to claim a seat in my own home was an inconvenience to her. She began forgetting to include me in family outings, trips to the park, dinners out, even the children's school plays. I'd find out about them later, usually through social media posts or overheard conversations. When I asked, she would just shrug and say, "Oh, I thought you wouldn't want to come." It was always framed as if she were doing me a favor by leaving me out, rather than admitting she wanted to avoid my presence entirely. Even my belongings weren't safe. She began moving my things without telling me. A sweater I left on the couch would disappear into a closet. My reading glasses would be placed in a drawer in another room. And once, she put my framed wedding photo in a box in the garage. She claimed it was to make space, but I knew it was to make me invisible. These weren't accidents. These were rehearsed, intentional cuts. They were small enough that they might seem harmless to an outsider, but they stacked up inside me like stones. Every day a new one was added. Every day the weight grew heavier. And still, I said nothing. I kept my head down, smiled when spoken to, and convinced myself that keeping the peace was more important than defending myself. But deep down, I knew something else was happening. She had forgotten who I was. She had forgotten the woman who worked 2 jobs to pay her tuition, who walked to work in the rain so she could keep the car for herself, who skipped meals to make sure there was enough for her. She had forgotten the mother who fought for her when she was too young to fight for herself. Or maybe she hadn't forgotten. Maybe she just didn't care anymore. Either way, those small humiliations weren't just hurting me. They were slowly shaping something else inside me, something that wasn't weakness anymore. Something that was starting to feel a lot like resolve. What she didn't realize, or maybe never bothered to think about, was that the walls around her, the roof over her head, and every brick of that house existed because of me. She didn't buy it. She didn't earn it. She didn't even put a cent toward the down payment. When her marriage was falling apart and she was left scrambling for a place to live with the children, I was the one who stepped in. I sold a piece of land your father and I had held on to for decades, land we'd dreamed of retiring on one day, so she could have a safe home. I signed the paperwork. I paid in full. And because I trusted her, because I believed blood meant loyalty, I put the deed in my name, but never mentioned it again. For years, she walked through those rooms like a queen, decorating them however she pleased, hosting parties, painting over walls without ever asking me. She introduced it to her friends as my home and bragged about the neighborhood, the garden, the size of the kitchen. I let her. I smiled quietly, thinking I was giving her the stability she deserved. I thought that's what a mother's love was, giving without asking for anything in return. But love can be mistaken for weakness, and she mistook mine for something she could control. She believed, truly believed, that because I was old, because I no longer had the energy to fight, she could treat me any way she wanted, and I would stay. She assumed I had nowhere else to go. She assumed I couldn't live without her. What she didn't know was that I still had my mind, my clarity, my memory of every sacrifice I had made. And most importantly, my name was still on the only thing she thought she could never lose. I started thinking about it more after the night in the rain. That moment was the shift, the point where my humiliation finally met my awareness. Sitting on that porch, soaked to the skin, I had time to think, time to remember that this wasn't just her home, it was mine. And unlike the love I'd given her, the legal papers didn't fade with age or cruelty. I remembered the conversations with the lawyer back then, the warnings he gave me about keeping the house in my name just in case. It's not about mistrust, he'd said. It's about protection. Back then, I laughed it off. I didn't think I would ever need to be protected from my own daughter. Now, his words played back in my head like a warning I'd ignored for too long. I also knew she never checked those kinds of things. She wasn't careful with paperwork or legal matters. She thought life was about appearances, about looking like you had it all, not actually securing it. She lived in that house like it was hers, simply because no one told her otherwise. And I was about to remind her, in a way she would never forget, that it wasn't. But I wasn't going to confront her. I wasn't going to shout or demand an apology. People like her, people who see kindness as weakness, they don't respond to words. They respond to consequences. And the best revenge is one that arrives quietly, without warning, so they never see it coming until it's already too late. So I kept my head down. I played my part, the quiet, aging mother who just wanted peace. I didn't push back when she criticized me. I didn't argue when she excluded me. I let her believe she was winning. Meanwhile, I started to lay the groundwork. I found the lawyer's old number. I made the call. I asked one simple question. Is the house still in my name? When he said yes, something in me finally breathed. I told him, good, because I'm ready to sell. From that moment, I knew I held every ounce of power she thought she had over me. She could control the dinner table, the outings, the tone of her voice when she spoke to me. But she couldn't control the one thing that truly mattered, the ground she stood on. And I was about to take it from her, just as she had taken my dignity. The morning after I confirmed the house was still in my name, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. My mind was sharp, my decision unshakable. There was no more wondering if she might change, no more hoping she'd come to her senses. That night in the rain had burned away the last bit of hope I had for her kindness. Now, it was about reclaiming what I'd built, and making sure she learned that cruelty has a cost. I didn't rush. Revenge, the kind that leaves a lasting mark, can't be sloppy. It has to be deliberate, planned with the same patience I once used to raise her. So I started small. I gathered my important documents, the deed, my identification, old financial records, and kept them in a worn leather handbag I carried everywhere. I didn't want her finding them, snooping through drawers, or getting suspicious. I kept smiling in front of her. I kept my voice calm. I still thanked her for the smallest things, even when I knew they were insults dressed as help. The next step was calling the lawyer again, this time to start the process. I told him I wanted the sale to be quick, private, and entirely in cash. No for sale signs, no open houses, no neighbors whispering before it was done. He understood immediately. He'd worked with enough families to know that sometimes blood ties turn poisonous. He said he had a couple in mind, an older husband and wife who had been looking for a place just like this. They were ready to buy without questions, and more importantly, without delays. In the meantime, I had to keep up appearances. That meant sitting through her little humiliations like nothing had changed. When she told me not to wear my shabby sweaters around her friends, I nodded. When she rolled her eyes at me for asking if I could bake cookies with the grandchildren, I pretended not to notice. Every act of cruelty only reminded me why I was doing this. Every sharp word made my resolve stronger. Within a few days, the buyers came to see the house. She wasn't home, off at a lunch with her friends, the kind where she bragged about her perfect life. I walked the buyers through each room, pointing out the light from the kitchen windows, the sturdy wood floors, the peaceful garden. I didn't mention her once. This wasn't about her anymore. This was about me taking back the life I'd been pushed out of. The lawyer worked quickly, just as I'd asked. The buyers offered full payment in cash and wanted to close within the week. I didn't hesitate. I signed the necessary papers without a flicker of doubt. Each stroke of the pen felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders, the weight of years of being dismissed, belittled, and treated like an afterthought. Once the deal was set, I began quietly packing the things that mattered to me. A few clothes, my late husband's watch, family photographs from before she turned cold, the cookbook with my mother's handwriting inside. I didn't need much. The rest could stay, just as she'd left it, because soon it wouldn't be hers to touch. In those final days before the sale, I watched her move through the house with that same false sense of ownership. She planned a weekend party in the garden, ordered new curtains for the living room, and spoke about future renovations she'd get around to. I said nothing. I smiled when she spoke, even helped her measure the windows. Inside, I knew she was making plans for a future that didn't exist anymore. The night before the sale closed, I sat alone in my room and looked around one last time. I thought of the day I'd handed her the keys, thinking I was giving her safety. I thought of the sacrifices, the nights I worked until my hands ached, the birthdays I missed to take double shifts, the dinners I skipped so she could have seconds. All of that had been given freely, without question. And in return, she'd given me a seat in the rain. By the next afternoon, it would be over. She wouldn't know until she tried to walk through the front door and found strangers living in what she thought was hers. There would be no warning, no explanation. Only the truth, hitting her as hard as the rain that once hit me. The morning of the closing, I woke before the sun. The house was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the wall clock in the hallway. I sat at the edge of my bed for a long moment, letting the weight of the day settle in. This wasn't just the end of my time here. It was the end of her illusion. She had treated this house as her kingdom, walking through it like every wall, every window, every brick belonged to her. By the time the sun set, she would learn it never did. I dressed in simple clothes, dark slacks, a cream blouse, and the cardigan my late husband had always loved. I wanted to look composed, not rushed. There was no need to leave in chaos. That would have given her too much satisfaction if she thought she'd driven me out. No, I was leaving on my own terms. I gathered my small suitcase, the leather handbag with my documents, and a canvas tote holding the few items that still mattered to me. Everything else, the furniture, the decorations, even the dishes in the cabinets, would stay. They weren't worth carrying into my new life. The buyers were scheduled to arrive around noon with the lawyer. I had arranged it so she would be out. She had an appointment at a spa, something she'd been bragging about for days. It was almost poetic, knowing she'd be lying under warm towels and scented oils while the walls of her so-called home were being signed over to someone else. At 11:30, I made one last slow walk through the house. I ran my fingers across the dining table, remembering the holiday meals I once cooked here. I paused by the living room window where the light used to fall across the floor while she played with her dolls. I even stood for a while in the kitchen, looking at the counter where I'd made countless school lunches. I let the memories come, but I didn't let them hurt me. This place had already stopped feeling like mine years ago. Today was just the paperwork catching up to the truth. The lawyer arrived first, carrying the final documents and a calm smile. The buyers followed, a kind middle-aged couple who had fallen in love with the house the moment they saw it. They brought a small bouquet of flowers, a gesture that felt more genuine than anything I'd received from my own daughter in years. We sat at the table, and I signed the papers without hesitation. Each signature felt like I was cutting the last thread between me and the cruelty I had endured here. When it was done, the lawyer handed me the check, a large, secure sum that represented decades of sacrifice and a clean slate. I tucked it into my handbag without ceremony. The couple thanked me warmly, and I handed them the keys. They promised to take care of the house, to fill it with kindness and laughter. I believed them. By 1 p.m., my suitcase was in the back of a taxi. I didn't look back as we pulled away from the driveway. There was nothing there for me anymore, and soon there would be nothing there for her either. I imagined her return later that day. The shock on her face when she saw cars in the driveway that weren't hers, strangers moving boxes through the front door. I pictured her trying to force her way inside, demanding answers and being told calmly that the house was sold, the deed transferred, and she had no claim to anything inside. The neighbors would watch from their porches, the same way they had looked away when she humiliated me. This time, they wouldn't be able to look away. The taxi turned onto the highway, and the house disappeared from view. My hands were steady, my breathing calm. I had thought this moment would feel heavy, but it didn't. It felt like stepping out of the rain into a room full of warm light. I didn't need her to apologize, and I didn't need her to understand. All I needed was the knowledge that I had taken back what was mine, and that she would finally taste the loneliness she had served me. I didn't tell her where I was going. I didn't leave a note. Some goodbyes don't need words. She must have come back around mid-afternoon. I wasn't there to see it, but the scene played in my mind as clearly as if I had been standing at the edge of the driveway. Her car would have pulled in fast, the tires crunching over the gravel. She probably noticed first that there was another vehicle in her parking spot, an unfamiliar silver sedan with the trunk open, boxes stacked neatly inside. Then she would have seen the moving truck parked by the curb, two men carrying furniture out of what she still thought of as her home. I can almost hear her voice, sharp, rising, cutting through the air as she demanded to know what was happening. One of the movers, polite but uninterested in drama, would have told her to speak with the owners inside. Owners. That word alone must have rattled her. She would have marched to the front door, her heels clicking against the path, and without thinking, she would have tried to unlock it with her key. I know exactly how it would have felt when the metal slid in but refused to turn, that sudden resistance, that sinking in her chest as the truth started to scratch at her. When she knocked, or more likely banged, on the door, the new couple would have answered. They would have been calm, almost apologetic, explaining that they had purchased the house just that morning, that the sale was final, and that they were sorry for any confusion. She would have laughed at first, a short disbelieving sound, telling them they must be mistaken, that this was her house. But the buyers, kind as they were, would have simply handed her the lawyer's business card and closed the door. That's when the panic would have set in. She would have called me, once, twice, a dozen times in a row, and each time the line would have gone to voicemail. I imagine her pacing in the driveway, dialing the lawyer's number, demanding answers. The lawyer, calm as always, would have explained the truth in words she couldn't twist. She had no legal claim, the deed was never in her name, and the sale was legitimate. Every sentence would have been another nail sealing the door she could never open again. Neighbors would have started watching by then, leaning on fences, peeking through curtains. They had seen her parade around that house for years, boasting about renovations she never paid for, telling people it would one day be hers. Now they were seeing the other side, the way her voice cracked as she argued with the empty air, the way her face flushed not with heat, but with humiliation. She might have tried one last desperate move, slipping around the back to test the patio door, or pressing her face to the windows to see if anything of hers remained inside. But there would have been nothing left for her. Every item worth keeping had been mine to give away or leave behind, and I had decided that nothing inside those walls belonged to her anymore. By evening, the street lights would have flickered on, casting a cold glow over the scene. She would still be standing there, phone in hand, trying to call me again and again. And each time, the silence on the other end would remind her of the silence she had given me for years, the unanswered calls when I needed her, the turned back when I sought her comfort. I didn't answer because there was nothing to say. She had made her choice the night she sent me outside in the rain, telling me I smelled old while she laughed with her friends over dinner. That night, she taught me that I was not welcome in her warmth. Today, I taught her that she was no longer welcome in mine. And as she stood outside a house that was no longer hers, with the cold beginning to bite and no one inviting her in, she finally knew what it felt like to be left out in the storm. I didn't watch her meltdown. I didn't linger in the city. The moment I handed the keys to the new owners, I turned my back and left. The bus ride to my new home was quiet, almost unnervingly so, but I welcomed the silence. For the first time in years, there was no tension humming in the background, no sharp words waiting to be thrown at me, no tightrope to walk just to keep the peace. I sat by the window, watching the city fade into smaller towns, and then smaller still, until the world outside was all open fields and the glitter of the distant sea. My new home isn't grand, but it is mine in every way that matters. A modest coastal apartment, 2 small rooms, a balcony that overlooks the water, and a kitchen that smells faintly of fresh bread from the bakery downstairs. The walls are bare for now, but they feel like a blank page waiting to be filled with things I choose, not things someone else allows. In the mornings, I sit out on that balcony with my tea, watching fishing boats drift out into the mist, and for the first time in years, my shoulders are not hunched against invisible blows. People here smile when they pass you on the street. They wave from their doorsteps. The woman who runs the corner shop already remembers my name and tells me to take my time when I count my coins. A retired fisherman who lives 2 doors down offered to show me the best spots for clams, and a little boy from the bakery sometimes brings me a slice of warm bread because you remind him of his grandma. In this place, I am not a burden. I am simply a neighbor, a person, someone worth greeting. I cook for myself now, not because no one else will, but because I want to. My food is simple, soup with fresh vegetables, bread still warm from the oven, but I eat it at my own table, in my own home, with no one telling me I don't belong. I light a candle at dinner, even if it's just for me, because I've learned that small acts of kindness to yourself are not luxuries, they are survival. Sometimes, the rain comes in hard off the sea, slanting sideways so it rattles the windows. On those nights, I make tea and sit by the glass, watching the storm and thinking of that night she sent me outside with a plate in my hands. I remember the cold rain soaking through my clothes, the sound of laughter drifting out from the warm glow of the dining room, and the way I told myself to just swallow the hurt because she's still your daughter. But now I understand something I didn't then. Blood doesn't excuse cruelty, and love without respect is just another chain. I don't hate her. Hate would still tie me to her. I feel something colder, cleaner, nothing at all. She is simply someone I used to know, someone who chose to show me where I stood in her world. I only returned the favor. I have not answered a single one of her calls. I will not. There's nothing left to say, no apology that would matter, no explanation that could undo the night she made me eat in the rain. She has her life to live, and I have mine. Only mine is free now. And here's the truth she will have to live with. The house she thought was her forever was never hers at all. I gave it to strangers because strangers treated me with more kindness than my own blood. She left me in the cold. I left her in the cold reality she created. Now, I live in the warmth of my own making.